Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Land Matters podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Flynn. On this show, we'll have a conversation with the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone, Yvonne Aki-Sawyer. She took office in that West African capital city in May 2018 after serving as head of the Freetown City Council. She's become a bit of a rock star, building on years as a finance professional. She's delivered 2 TED Talks about turning dissatisfaction into action and Freetown's initiative to plant 1 million trees. She was named to the Time 100 Next list of emerging leaders. She's also active in the C40 Cities Global Network and launched the Transform Freetown Planning Initiative. And most notably, as we'll talk about, she appointed Africa's first chief heat officer to confront the impacts of climate change. So here's our interview recorded in the fall. I wanted to start out with the Transform Freetown Initiative as a planning and action framework. Could you give us the big picture of what this is all about and your assessment of its progress?
I ran for office in 2018, having never been in politics or public sector life before, motivated by concerns around the environment and sanitation. That campaign message, Community for Progress for Freetown, is what then translated into Transform Freetown. So we took those areas as a team and put them into 4 categories, 4 clusters: resilience, human development, healthy city, and urban mobility. The priority sectors started with resilience, environmental management. Not surprising, that was the real driver for my political decision. But it also looked at urban planning and housing because you cannot separate the two. And then in that bucket of resilience, we have revenue mobilization, an appreciation that sustainability will only come from the city's ability to sustainably generate revenue itself. So that was cluster 1. And cluster 2 was human development, recognizing that it's the people who make up the city. And there we had education, skills development, job creation with a focus on tourism, where we felt there was a big potential for the city. And finally, persons with disability. The third category, the third cluster, had within it sanitation, which I mentioned goes very closely with environmental management for Freetown and many African cities. If you think about climate change, our teeny weeny contribution to climate change, a lot of it actually comes from methane, from open dumping, but it also has huge health implications. So under a healthy city was sanitation, health, and water. And finally, urban mobility. How do you get around the city? What we did was, having come into office with those high-level areas of concern, we then engaged residents. I had 322 focus groups with about 15,000 residents to get their views on affordability, accessibility, and availability of services across those sectors. We then went into technical sector working groups, were invited the public, private sector, ministries, departments, and agencies, as well as the international community via development partners and NGOs to participate in roundtable discussions. I'm really taking for each of those sectors the data that we had available, research papers that have been written, and defining a problem statement and a theory of change. Out of that process came 19 specific targets that we're working to under Transform Freetown. So that as a high level is what Transform Freetown is about. Those targets are measurable. We report against them every year back to the city, back to our residents on progress. It really has been a way of introducing greater accountability, of holding our own feet to the fire. But I think as well, an offshoot of that has been one of our objectives in the way that Transform Freetown is done, which is for it to be very much community-owned and community-driven.
Of all the climate threats the city faces, whether flooding or landslides, you appointed a chief heat officer. Why was a chief heat officer necessary, and what has been the results thus far?
When people talk about climate change, even with the language of climate change for our residents, and this is a question that I'm asked often, how do you get ordinary people to be interested in climate change? In our case, it's not hard when you put it in terms of the practical impacts on their lives, because the consequences of climate change are intensely felt in our part of the world. And we suffer greatly from flooding, landslides, hence my concern with the environment and being able to mitigate against those impacts. I have to give credit to the Ashrock Resilience Center, who really got us thinking about the fact that there are more deaths from extreme heat than there are from the more visible, tangible disasters like the floods, like the landslides. Extreme heat, particularly where water is in short supply, is a major feature, a major impact of the climate change and the warming of our climate. And in our case, the vulnerable are mainly those living in informal settlements. That's 35% of our city's population, where in those informal settlements, the housing structures are typically made from corrugated iron. With increased temperatures, you're effectively living in an oven. But the other aspect of that is that we have an informal economy. I think the figures around 60% of women in our city are involved in trading. Most of our markets are outdoor. So you're sitting in the sun all day long. Through the work that we've been doing with women under our health sector, we're doing work with them on non-communicable diseases like hypertension and diabetes. There's a high salt intake, there's a high carbohydrate intake, and there's a lack of mobility, very sedentary, being a trader and sitting at that stall. But doing that under the intense heat means that the negative health consequences are exacerbated. Like I said, Ashrock got us thinking about this through inviting us to be part of an alliance of city heat champions and the progression to actually getting somebody to focus on heat. We focus on flooding, we focus on landslides. Our disaster risk management unit that we set up for the first time ever in the city had in its initial thinking the disasters that we see every rainy season, the floods coming from the rains, planting the million trees, what we do about the mangroves, what we do about, improving drainage, all of those things. We're speaking to the obvious, the visible. With the chief heat officer, we now are going to be able to embark on some research, because that's the first thing, to understand what's the data saying. We have the anecdotes, but what's the data saying? So the chief heat officer's a main part of her work is being able to build that information and collect that data for us to identify the heat islands. I think, again, anecdotally, we sort of have a sense of where those are, mainly in informal settlements, but potentially also in the middle of the city. We need to be able to make arguments to challenge what's going on with the lack of building permits and land use planning being devolved to the city and the massive deforestation that continues to go unabated. Whilst that data collection is going on, we've been really thrilled that with that sort of focus, we've been able to already work on some immediate projects. The chief heat officer has worked with market women and gotten funding, I think it's from Ashrock, to install market shade covers in 3 of our open markets. And I was actually at one of those markets on Saturday. And it's great to see the enthusiasm and the excitement of the women and them saying, are we going to get this all the way along the market? We can see where it's starting, where it stops, but we need it too.
What are your hopes for other climate mitigation projects, including the tree planting initiative? How did that come about and how is it going?
Well, it came about because there's an appreciation that we're losing our vegetation, and that makes the effect of extreme weather events. So planting a million trees, is working towards doing that to increase vegetation cover by 50%. But we also have flood mitigation, which is an annual exercise of identifying areas where you have the long-term plan, you plant 1 million trees, it takes years for them to be fully established and to give the benefits that you're looking for. So in the meantime, you still have the runoff from the mountains filling the drains with silt. So our flood mitigation work on an annual basis goes through the city, identifies the worst of these areas and clears the silt so that when the rains come, the water can still flow. On a smaller scale, we've also been able to, I think it's something like 2,000 meters of drainage that we've been able to build in smaller communities and improve the drainage for the very same reasons. Beyond that, we've really invested heavily in training and capacity building within communities through disaster management committee. What climate change does in a rural community will impact Freetown. If people are experiencing crop failure out of Freetown, they will eventually, unfortunately, in many cases, it will eventually drive a rural urban migration because they are unable to sustain their livelihoods and they're going to come to the city looking for some means of making a living. That pressure of population growth in the city is something else that we have to deal with. So whether it's introducing the cable car to improve transportation and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and unhealthy carbon monoxide emissions from old vehicles which sit in traffic all day in the city, to encourage the government to devolve land use planning and building permit functions so that we can actually introduce land management actions which save life and save property, but also protect the environment and prevent people from building properties in waterways and streams and canals, which currently happens, all of which make the impact of extreme weather patterns, which are created by climate change. All of this is made worse by not using legislation and urban management tools, such as land use planning and building permitting, in a constructive manner.
Property tax reform has gained a lot of attention there. Could you describe those efforts and the outcomes you've seen thus far in the overall context of municipal fiscal health?
We worked on this property tax reform, moving from 37,000 properties on the database of a city that's a capital city with at least 1.2 to 1.5 million people. 37,000 properties. When I came in, it was clear that that was not reflective of reality, but also that the manual system that they operated literally with a ledger book was not really fit for purpose in the 21st century. One of our 19 targets is to increase property rate tax. In fact, it's to increase tax income fivefold by 2022. To go about doing that, we needed to digitize. We changed from an area-based system to a points-based system. We worked on what, in very sort of simple, summarized explanation, was taking a satellite image of the entire city, using technology to measure the roofs, then sending out teams, identifying features, building an algorithm to give weightings to those features, testing it against a database of actual 3,000 properties whose values were determined by real chartered surveyors. So we got the old type assessment done. And then using the algorithms, we looked at the regression analysis, the line of fit between what the algorithm was doing and what the chartered surveyors' results were coming out at. Now you fit in about 21 features and out comes your property rate. And that includes the roof size, the roof measurement, it includes the numbers of floors, it includes the features, windows, about outdoor space, as you would imagine, and also location. Through that digitization process, we were able to move from 37,000 properties to over 120,000 properties. That meant we were able to meet our target of increasing our property rate revenue from 7 billion to over 35 billion. That in itself is the pathway to sustainability, and being able to invest. A big part of fiscal health is that sustainability.
Where do you find inspiration in the face of so many challenges?
From the fact that we have been able to make a difference in the lives of Freetonians, we've been able to test and to see how much can be achieved if one is given the space to do so. We know that so much is possible, and so we keep going.
Well, that is it for this edition of the Land Matters podcast, an inspiring conversation with the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone. For further reading, go to our website, lincolnints.edu, and to Landlines magazine, where an edited version of the interview has been published online as part of the ongoing Mayor's Desk feature. The Lincoln Institute has been active in Africa, working with governments and scholars and practitioners on issues like climate change, the property tax, and the fiscal health of local governments, and using value capture to fund affordable housing and many other priorities. As always, we hope you'll rate, share, and subscribe to the Land Matters podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Until next time, thanks for listening.